Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings, and a helping side of salutations with an extra side of welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and I am joined by the Mr. Marvelous Mr. So you do it. Yeah, that says, it is Russ. How's it going?
Hey, how you doing, Tristan? Happy Monday to you.
Yes, happy Monday indeed. It's a good Monday. It's a warmer Monday, right? If for those out in the East Coast.
Yep.
Yeah, that's why we're so bright and cherry today, right? All of our
I
colors.
know, right? I mean, look at all this sun.
Yeah.
Natural light. I love it.
And for those who are joining for the first time, let us do the proper introductions. So I am Tristan Watty. I come to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. And Russ is...
I am Russ. I am from the Security Incident Response team, where we help contain and mitigate security events or incidents or just bad security days in general.
Yes. And we're also joined by the great producer, Jeff. So thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Ari, for tuning in. So let us start out by asking the question we always like to ask. Where is everyone tuning in from, dialing in from, listening from, or just plain old viewing again? So if you don't want to answer that question, we have another one for you. And that second, more specific question is a fun one, right? So I want you to take that step back because you're going to need it with all this text. Where would you rather have to eat the exact same breakfast every single day for a year, or never know what you're going to eat for breakfast until the moment it appears in front of you? Russ, the choice is yours and yours alone.
I'm going to have to go with never know what you're going to eat for breakfast until the moment appears in front of you. For two reasons. One, I would get very sick of whatever that one thing is I had to have every single day. And so I'd probably eat breakfast more if it was just some random thing. And also that means I don't have to think or choose what to eat for breakfast. So it's a win-win for me.
See, it's interesting, right? Because how many variations of breakfast do you have, right? Like on a normal basis, this is where my mind, I went down a deep tangent, right? This is what we did. You know, we missed last week. Sorry for missing last week. We're going to make up for it with double the tangents, right? That's 2 to the second power. I know that's 4, but who's counting? So I would go down. I would do the single breakfast item every day for a year. You know why? Because 1, I could be healthy, and 2, I don't get the item that I do not want, right? Because think of it this way. If you hit a bad streak, you're not having breakfast at all for whatever period of time until you have good luck, right? So that's what I'm thinking of, like the breakfast varieties. Like I don't eat eggs, right? So what are my chances of hitting eggs in breakfast food?
A lot.
So I'm just like, if I had to pick oatmeal every day, and I'm like, all right, it's oatmeal, but then for lunch I can have whatever I want, right? So that's kind of my little tangent for the day. So feel free to put your tangents. Which one would you pick? But what you don't have to pick is today's topic, because it's already picked out for you, because it's the deployment time when it comes to DLP. And this is a sequel episode, but I'm not going to spoil it anymore because Russ is going to tell us where we were and where we're going today.
Yes, I'm glad you did the voice, the stutter. That was great. But yeah, last week, 2 weeks ago rather, not last week, we had our New Game Plus Agentic AI levels up your DevSecOps pipeline. That was a great episode, but you don't need to have watched it to understand this week's episode, which is it's time to deploy the DLP sequel arc. And I went too fast on the D's. I messed it up.
See, it's okay, because you know what's going to happen? By the end of the episode, you'll say it 10 more times and you get it perfect.
Exactly. We've got a lot of practice, lots of practice coming up. So
I'll get it better.
a better shot.
The funny thing is, people may wonder why we're saying it like that. Well, there's a particular children's card game based show that we like to watch that it has a iconic opening. Let's just say that. If you know what it is, you know what it is. But what I do know is, Lewis, good morning to you as well. So I think it hones in on a couple of different things, right? And we're specifically saying it 4 times because we're speaking about 4 different topics, but they all have the overarching piece of data loss prevention, right? How do you summon your protection to your DLP strategy, right? Is it something you summon, or is it something that you should just start out with, right? When you're looking at the AWS services, which ones pop into your head when you're speaking about DLP, right? There's one in particular most may gravitate towards, but you can have a mix of different services to help out with your overarching strategy because it's more than just one service. It's defense in depth. And why is it defense in depth? Well, you've activated my trap card if you know which direction I'm going, because automation remediation workflows, I'm telling you, the puns are just going to keep coming. So
they're all blocked up from last week. So
yeah, I have to say them, right? Or they just go into the ether to be picked back out by me. But automation remediation workflows, how can you get to the point where you have different mechanisms within your environment that helps with, 1, maybe self-healing, but 2, detection and preventative? We're going to stick there for today's episode. There's some proactive, but let's do detect and preventative, right? So that you can power up not only your deck, but your overall resources within your AWS environment, right? Think of your detection rules. How do you fine-tune alerts? All those different items that play into your larger security strategy. And then thinking of ways to scale your DLP across your environment. Think of your multi-account environments with multiple pieces of maybe sensitive information. There's different data classification types. How do you deal with that? Well, stay tuned while we say hi from Brazil. Thanks for joining in. So I think the place to start is just a general question, right? So when you think of automated remediation or your automated remediation workflows, what's your biggest concern about implementing them? From customers, we've heard a couple different varieties. One is false positives causing disruptions, right? Hey, this one alert triggered and it brought down something. Or the complexity of trying to set up a multi-step workflow, or lack of human oversight, or the testing of it. Russ, which way do you go?
I go in the lack of human oversight in automated actions. I think that's one of the key, I don't want to say challenges that, a security team is facing, is how are we ensuring that the things that we're doing and the things that we're containing or cutting off or whatever your remediation steps are actually done properly in the time that they're supposed to be, especially when you have things like the break glass accounts and stuff like that that are really only meant to be, used in those sorts of situations, and you don't want that to happen erroneously or unnecessarily, especially because those tend to have such unrestricted access to be able to do whatever they're supposed to be doing. So that's what I'd say rather.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point, right? Because if you go a little bit closer into it, right, you see it kind of boils down into, do we understand the different pieces of our environment and who interacts with them and what restrictions apply to it? What I mean by that is, if you go into what you were just speaking about with the break glass role, it's like, okay, how do you gain access to that break glass role, right? What is the process? Do you have a JIT mechanism, a just-in-time access mechanism, in order to say, okay, it has to go through this approval, this approval, this approval, this approval for it to happen? Or is there an open bridge in an incident response scenario that stakeholder A has to sign off on that kicks off, and two turnkeys, all that kind of good stuff, right? It's interesting, right? So with me, I kind of go towards the complexity for that reason. And why I mention the complexity is usually the complexity stems from trying to figure out the unknown, right? It's, hey, we want to do this. Okay, but we have to figure out how this is implemented. Well, we'll get back to that. So we'll do this instead, right? That's usually the conversations we have. It's like, hey, why don't we trying to solve in a different manner, fashion, form, and way, right? That's kind of how I do it, right? It's usually take that step back as we look at things and kind of go through, hey, how do we think about DLP within our environment? How do we summon some great services, resources to advance our overall DLP strategy? Because in previous episodes, we spoke about a particular service, Macy, right? Spoilers for an old episode, but feel free to watch it, so it's not spoilers anymore. So we spoke about some of the foundational architectures, right? Being able to have something scanning your S3 buckets in Macy's example to understand where your gaps are. Hey, is this bucket public? Does it contain sensitive information? Is it both? Please don't be both, right? Those are the conversations we start to have, right? So when you think of, hey, how do we go to the next step? This is kind of part of the conversations we like to have. And we have a question. Lewis, what are the core objectives of DLP SQL Arc in terms of deployment strategy? So I would say the key objective is, hey, how do we deploy a DLP strategy that is scalable, repeatable, and also accounts for the different pieces of the organization, right? So that's where we were speaking about the enterprise multi-account environment. When you have those different pieces of the puzzle you have to account for. So that's kind of where we're trying to drive this. And let's see if we stay on the rails or not. But thank you for that question, Lewis. I think another piece of this is just understanding how critical something like Macy is to your automated data discovery. Because to our earlier conversations of, hey, do you understand where the sensitive information is within your environment? At a high level is usually what the answer is. But what is the actual tangible item that you can look and point towards and say, hey, these are the buckets that are not sensitive and these are the ones that are, right? And you can use other third-party partners as well to detect these items. But what we're trying to get to is, do you have that checkbox? Do you have something to monitor in a way? And that's kind of where we start to roll off into the other pieces of the puzzle of having something like CloudWatch monitoring. Right? Why? Well, you need something real-time visibility into your data protection events. You need something to say, hey, if somebody like, I don't know, an incident responder were to have, let's say, an open bridge or an investigation or something that they're going down, what are they going off of, right? Russ, I don't know if you fell into that before. Is like, you need some items to go off of. It's like, hey, there was some data exfiltration. How?
Yeah, definitely. Because it takes time to answer those questions if you don't have them ahead of time or beforehand or prepped to have those at the time that the incident is discovered. So that can really waste a lot of time trying to answer those questions when they should be easy answers. So yes, absolutely see that all the time, especially when, we have different customers with different backgrounds, different purposes for their accounts. So you see all sorts of things, people with extremely mature teams who, are realizing that maybe something got through their DLP architecture, and other teams who don't have something set up and they weren't really sure what they were looking to do and or didn't know that they had to. So it was kind of so it's definitely something that we've seen, I say we as in my team, but it's definitely something I've seen and happens regularly, and it'll definitely decrease the amount of actionable response that you can do in that immediate time. So that's kind of
And we have some questions from Lewis. How does the deploy approach different from traditional deployment methods? And what lessons from the original DLP arc are applied in the sequel? So I would say, Lewis, overarching what this episode is helping to reinforce is enhance kind of the understanding of data loss prevention within your AWS environment. So what we're trying to do is have a conversation about what are some of the other steps that you can take. So if the original episode we focused on, hey, just what DLP is, now we're taking other steps to kind of advance from crawl to walk to run, right? So that's kind of where we're going with this, where it's not so much as, hey, this is a solution you need to implement. It has everything baked in, but this is more the framework conversation that you can have in terms of, hey, this is where we're trying to head with a customer when we're having conversations. For example, we were just talking about monitoring. Do you have something like your config rules within your environment? That's a big part of the puzzle, right? Are you using config? Because some conversations may start at that point, right? You have to kind of break things down to the ones and zeros, as I say, because when you're having conversations, sometimes you might have multiple tools within the environment that you think one of them is doing the job, but until you have that conversation and say, okay, what triggers this? What happens from this direction? That's when, pieces of the puzzle start to come together. So thank you definitely for that question, because what we're trying to get to is, one, do we have an understanding? And then two, can we move towards something like Lambda creates an event-driven pipeline that eliminates some of the different pieces of the puzzle that we're trying to solve for, right? So it ensures that a data loss or exfiltration, hey, it's not going to take 4 hours. Can we bring that down to maybe a minute or automatically, right? When we're talking about these type of things. So I think part of the conversation also that needs to be had is, how do you validate? Right? I think that's an important part of the puzzle, because you have these solutions, but how do you do the essential testing? And how do you allow yourself to test? Because a lot of conversations say, hey, we have this solution and it works in this one use case. But is that one use case the amount you should have tested for your environment, right? Based on your scale and scope, and especially if you have multi-accounts and things of that nature. Because having something that's not tested can create that false sense of security, which can also be a little bit, let's say, bad, right? Because if you know you don't have protection at all, then you say, okay, I don't have this type of protection, opposed to having the conversations of, all right, well, yeah, we have something in place, and not finding out later during an incident, like, oh, we didn't have that. We didn't have those logs. Yeah, we didn't have that environment. So I guess
incident response is not the time when you want to find out about your weaknesses. You'd hopefully know those ahead of time.
Yes, it's a reoccurring thing, right? So, Russ, when you're speaking from that automated workflow perspective, right? Mm-hmm. What's some of the things that you want to define up front when you're thinking of it from an incident responder perspective?
Yes. So while I am going to go into that, I just want to take a real quick tangent. It took you 16 minutes to bring up config, and I just want to say that that's impressive. I thought that would have happened much earlier in this episode. So I just wanted to point that out. That was fun. But from an incident response lens, let's call it, there's a couple things that we want to look out for. Some of those trap cards that you were referring to. But yeah, so one of the things that I think is probably one of the biggest things and can waste such of those immediate first couple, minutes or hours, can absolutely be wasted by waiting because there was not, I mean, I hate to say this because I always say it all the time, but there's no incident response plan or any sort of, upfront decisions made about, the logic of the, workflow, or, whether they just said, make the workflow in an incident response way. And that's not the way that incident response works within your organization. So having those things matched up, the actual business operations workflow with your incident response workflow is going to be super important. That's why, organizations like NIST and all of the other security authority organizations, they don't really give you a dedicated, here's your incident response plan. They give you incident response templates, and they give you information about the incident response life cycle, but the incident response plan itself is so specific to each organization. So if you're going to use logic that wasn't custom built to your environment, then that could waste a lot of time as you realize things are not logically the way that they should be within your existing workflow and operations. There's some other ones. So things like implementing IAM policy revocation triggers. That's preventing privilege escalation paths from being exploited. That sort of thing is the preventative type of automation that we're trying to do in this episode. So that's kind of like these things that we take in for different aspects of security, not just incident response or DLP, and then applying them to DLP. So, things like the S3 auto quarantine workflow, which is a very easy to trigger event. But that's essential. Well, that's going to be essential. So is doing warm-ups before the show, which I have not, obviously, as you can tell with my mush mouth today. But that's the sort of thing that will allow you to isolate compromised or sensitive information leaking buckets, and being able to isolate those, even though they might not be fully under your control, or to be able to contain and be able to stop that exfiltration from continuing or becoming more severe, worse. So there's a lot of different things that we want to take into consideration with this lens of DLP, because it builds into the overarching your wow, words are not my strength today. Can you say the threat informed thing, Tristan?
The threat informed thing, and as we keep moving on in words, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, the one that apparently you haven't foot stomped enough because I can't think of the word.
Yeah, no, I think probably the way to do it is, what we always like to do is kind of dive into it a little bit, right? Just zoom in onto that. I think part of where you're going is having an understanding of how everything connects, so that when something tries to break that connection, you say, this is my trap card, and this is how we're going to protect against whatever may happen. And how do you do that? How do you develop such mechanisms? Well, you have something like Event Bridge, right? Where the rules, when they work together in tandem, help to make sure that things are routed appropriately, right? That the workflow kicks off instantly. And to take that step back out again to some of the points that Lewis brings up is, how does SQL impact team coordination, operational efficiency? That right there is by having the conversations ahead of time and getting to a point where, hey, we understand the workflow. Now we can optimize how responses are going to be handled before the team initially gets brought into whatever type of incident response mechanisms they have. If it's, hey, everybody gets onto a bridge, and then that bridge, you have all the information already predefined and kind of warmed up. If this were the steps taken, this is what happened. Now you can focus more on the post activities opposed to the during activities, right? And that's kind of what we're trying to address as a challenge as well, is how do I refine my strategies? How do I refine my human in the loop? How do I refine my test workflows? All these are things that you have to bring up first in order to orchestrate. And I think that's kind of where you're going, Russ, right? Where you're having those different pieces. How do you make it one cohesive, right? It's almost like having a pizza. It's like, yeah, plain pizza can do the job, but pepperoni or something else on top just makes it a little bit better, right?
Yes,
I know anchovies,
absolutely.
Russ. I know you.
Definitely. But yeah, but exactly like you say, that's the type of situation or even just the data that works really well with automation. You already have predefined decisions in predefined scenarios. So why not automate that so that way you don't have to rely on a human clicking a button when the decision has already been made. It's important to note where's those decisions that do have to be made by a human for the automation to continue, but that's still, I mean, the point still remains. It's still something that can be improved by having it occur automatically when a set of circumstances arise, whether that's through Lambda or step functions, which we have talked about previously, and that's actually a good episode. Go back to and find that one as well. While you're going back to our original DLP episode and looking back at all that good information. So that step functions does allow you to have a level of flexibility, customization within your DLP, and just your automated remediation or response workflows in general will be improved by being able to have the flexibility and much more complex sequences or structures in place. So there's so many things outside of just, hey, here's Macy, this is your DLP tool. You have to think of it with IAM and S3 and your event bridge rules and within your config environment and using step functions to allow for more complexity. So it's all of these things that we're focusing on as far as a security team, just with a very specific lens of DLP. And like everything we do, whether it's detections or our response, we got to test it. So we have to make sure that we're testing in sandbox solutions before we're actually pushing things to production, because that is a more secure workflow. And so it's just basically, for me, everything comes down to defense in depth and thinking each step-by-step process, and then just implementing that in an automated way that will help with that specific aspect of security, which is DLP. So yeah, just to basically heavily emphasize that DLP is not equal to Macy, and this is a much more I don't want to say convoluted, but complex environment than just I turned Macy on and now I have DLP.
Yes. And the best way to learn from that is from learning about other legends, right? You see how that ties in there, right?
Wonderful.
Yeah, right? Because that's where a lot of the prescriptive guidance comes from, right? It's just understanding the service, how individuals have implemented the service, and the iterations that, different customers have went through when they think about DLP within their environment. So to help with that, let us go on a side quest to speak about a fictitious customer scenario. So as we cue, we'll go with this theme today. Very, very because today we have both financial technologies. Sounds like a fictitious company to me, because if we look at this customer scenario, this is where we delve in to their legend, because they thought they had their vault locked down. Right? They migrated their digital banking and payment platforms to AWS. Great. That was over a year and a half ago. But now they're looking to enhance their environment because, hey, we have centralized logging across 84 banking products. We have organization-wide guardrails. We have deployed a network fortress architecture. Right? That's kind of how those conversations go. But they started to grow a little bit more. And what they found out is as they grew, as they acquired, as they merged, they started to think about, hey, what happens next? And that piece of next is always the uncertain nature of when you're looking into the future, right? I like to just put those emphasis, right? Yeah, exactly. So when you're trying to predict that, how do you predict the future? Well, you have to know where you're coming from the past. And that's where we bring onto stage our side quest board, because that side quest board is that visualization from a customer perspective that we bring live in person, kind of, right? Where you start to think about it is, hey, this is my AWS environment. And if we have our authenticated users and we have our unauthenticated users, we have our AWS environment, we have our S3 bucket. So usually these things are further apart, but we're speaking from a DLP perspective today. And things are always a little bit closer. It's usually 1 to 2 degrees of separation from exfiltration. And what are those things that are protecting you and making that a little bit more when it comes to defense in depth approach? So this is where our vault line CISO wants to go, right? We've built the vault. We've built on AWS, but how do we continue to grow? Well, let's think of it this way. Within our scenario, where do we draw our roads? I think that's the interesting question. But the more pressing question is, hey, did we hit a scaling pipeline? What I mean by that is, can our pipeline scale for DLP at the scale that we're going at? Right? Scaling pipeline sounds a little bit better, though. So if we think about that, let's listen to our scenario. Mergers, acquisitions, and financial company, maybe they absorb some different healthcare pieces, which may cause PHI. Maybe they have different PII needs. Now, how do you handle data classifications within the environment? Are developers following the guardrails you have in place? Do you have guardrails for all of the developers? These are all interesting parts of the puzzle, because you might have a developer that, hey, maybe they need legit access to something, and you have, let's picture CloudFront with a WAF and all that good stuff, right, that they're entering. But if you have this application hanging off and you have WAF rules, what are your WAF rules, right? What rules do you put into play? And as you put those rules into place, what are the different pieces that you should think about? Because when the dogs are barking, what is occurring, right? What is happening in your environment? That's kind of what it sounds. It's like, oh yeah, the dogs are barking over there. But what you really have to think of is, what did that alert mean for our organization? And I asked this to Russ. DLP, data security strategy. What are some of the examples of scaling issues that a company like this would fall into?
Oh man, so the big one that I see is creating, as there's more traffic and more growth, just creating all of these new custom rules and trying to add in all of these things instead of trying to tune or tweak what they have already existing. So for example, taking, maybe one of their rules is based off of a Lambda that triggers every time there's maybe, instead, because they're dealing with such growth, instead of having a block function on their WAF, they have a count function, and that count function has an alert. But maybe it's alerting too often because they have so many, they have a bigger space in the internet now. So that means more unwanted traffic as much as there is wanted traffic. So maybe those sorts of alerts are too much now, and maybe they need to, edit those to be maybe something that they throw into step functions that allows for more complexity. So that adds in that sort of, okay, not only is this an alert from the WAF, but is this relevant to actually the security team, or is this just some, crypto mining IP from 8 years ago? That sort of thing. So that's what I'm gonna say, is not only considering scale of your traffic and your security, but also of the rules and triggers within your security architecture.
Yes, because that's the thing that you're looking at, is all those different pieces of the puzzle that you're trying to add up, pretty much add up to the point that, hey, we can't keep up. Why can't we keep up? Well, we have to understand all those different pieces of the puzzle. As Russ was talking, the scenario grew where we have our Lambda and we have, let's say, a CloudTrail generating logs that triggers something. But the problem is hey, what does it trigger? It goes nowhere at this point. If you don't have the DLP architecture in place to deal with said trigger, right? So when we start to think of, hey, how do we solve for this? I think that's the real question of, hey, there's a CloudTrail alarm or an API call, let's just say, from CloudTrail that says, okay, I need to do something with this. But that's kind of where our story takes that little bit of a pause. Because I think this is where you have that eureka moment. That's that, hey, we need a smarter DLP right now moment. Right? Because if you think about it, it's like, okay, we have this API call, it goes, Lambda has it, but Lambda's not going to do anything with it unless I tell it to do something specific. What do we do? Right? And I think this is a good place to hit a good old pause game, right? The Zach Morris timeout, as we like to call it. Because when you think about our scenario, it's not that far off. It's to the point where it's really common, where it's, hey, do we have any automation to trigger based on a certain API action? And do we have the logic to build in this, like, oh, no, this is not false. Well, this is real. This is exactly, right? Those are the conversations that you start to have that we'll get back to that later. We'll revisit that in Q1 or Q2 or 3 or 4 or 10 years from now, right? Because we have tool searching at the minimum baseline. But do we understand our baseline to say that's our minimal, right? So as we continue to go down and have these conversations, what essentially we're trying to avoid is, the sad music playing in the background, right? Where it's just like, wait, we could have avoided this if we kind of went back to that ticket sooner. Right? That's kind of the conversation of, we almost had it, but we didn't. Right? It was in our queue, but we didn't solve for it. Russ, how many of those kind of conversations have you heard where it's just like, oh, we meant to work on this. Oh, this is scheduled for next year.
All the time. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sometimes those plans get, sped up a little bit after they're, dealing with my team. But yes, that does happen a lot. And to go back to an earlier point, when you were talking about just having that information and where are those alerts going, it's pretty common to see in incident response, because you have all these alerts and you set up your very complex infrastructure, and then you have all these alerts, you have the investigative tools and everything, and you find out, okay, here's a true positive, a security incident, we found one finally. What now?
Yep. And how many times is it's like, okay, break out the playbook. There's nothing in the folder. Know, it's that level of item. And, if there's not a physical playbook, chances are it's not an automated playbook to go with that. And I think what the other conversation point goes to as well is just, hey, how much can intelligent DLP with like agentic AI help with kind of shaping this, right? Because you could essentially have your multi-agent architecture with, you know, some agents built into that, right? Where it can kind of triage things. But the part you have to understand is that initial part of just what's your environment structure? What's your data classifications? And I say this a little bit closer. What's your data classifications? Just
Yeah.
for the individuals on the other side of the internet, because that's often a conversation of, hey, did we have a conversation about data classification? Yes, this is confidential and this is, you know, not. Okay. Well, in an incident, that might not help as much, right? Because having a binary choice sometimes leads to more effort exerted. And more effort exerted means more resources used. More resources translates to money, translates to slower time, yada, yada, yada. But what we're trying to understand is, okay, if we can leverage agents to break up these chunks, what pieces do we have to have in place to assist this piece a little bit more, right? And also, do they have access to the same data sets, right? Because least privilege, do you have it designed in a way that you can have least privilege? And that goes back to data classification and who has access and for what period of time do they have access. So I think it's an interesting concept because I don't know, Russ, from your side, how do data classifications come up? Is it, okay, we need to search for something? Or is it more like, oh, we're going to start with this?
So for me, it's usually data classification generally comes up most often in data exfiltration. So if there's a bucket, specific bucket or something like that that has been determined to be a higher classification or more critical in nature, then that's when really for me there's no difference. We'll check to see maybe specifically in those critical resources whether things were accessed or exfiltrated out. But it doesn't really change all that much from an incident response perspective. It's still, I mean, it can sometimes change where the data is accessed. And then, there's that question of, okay, well, how did they know where the critical data was? That sort of question. But from a response standpoint, it's really just in severity for the other maybe business functions, but it's still the same processes. You're just very aware of that this is important, and if we have a evidence that this sort of information, which is usually when it's critical, it's some sort of compliance, PII, customer data, like credit card information, this type of stuff, that can have some legal implications as far as reporting, and when you have to report and how much time once we find evidence that there was critical information exfilled. So that's more of a legal function than a technical security function. So from the incident responder standpoint, not much. You have to still be prepared with the outcome of your investigation and the forensics, but that's more of a legal pushover. So
yeah, it's interesting because the mental picture I have in my brain is picture a superhero and the villain it's usually like the school bus and then somebody close to the superhero and they drop them both at the same time. It's like, now choose, right? That kind of thing. And it's like, it's like, so when it comes to data classification, if you have PHI data and then PCI data, where do you put your efforts, right? Because if they're both potentially exfiltrated, so do you start to go down like, oh, what is the route that this one took out and how did this happen? Because it might not have been the same, let's say, attack surface that it used in order to try and exfiltrate, right? It could have been one, this is a method that we're using to go now because we need the PCI type of information like credit card and socials. And then we're also doing this one just because it'll trigger alarms as well, right? So it is interesting from that standpoint, because now how does your DLP strategy react to it? Then does it react differently?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And incident response does have to do a lot of rapid reprioritization. So like for example, the scenario you laid out, right? You're like, wow, okay, we have these two resources that are relatively important that have both been hit. And then you say, oh, we don't even know if this was from the same attack or not, which instantly in my mind goes, oh, okay, so that means we have to find out if that's the case, because do we have two holes where there are people able to get in, or is there just one? And if it's just one, how many people are exploiting that one? And that sort of information really drives how you prioritize the rest of the incident. So that's why I said earlier, that not having that information immediately when you should with your alerts and the way that your DLP strategy is set up, you should know about it relatively quickly, especially when you're talking about that critical information like PII or PHI or all the other different types of data. And so which there's tons, but so that's why you need that information immediately, so that way you can say, okay, did this come in from similar alarms? Did this come in from, this one came in through S3 and this one came in through EC2? What is happening? So that sort of thing can definitely very much branch off into all sorts of different having to reprioritize, gather new evidence in a location that maybe they weren't ready for. So there's all these different things that can really come in and just waste a lot of time in an incident scenario when time is of the essence, especially when you're dealing with something like exfiltration, and especially if something that's being exfiltrated that is very critical. So all of those things are like essentially a nightmare situation, because you have to prioritize. Okay, do we stop the bleeding of the data? Do we plug in the holes as much as we can? How do we contain this beast? And that is through having the information and evidence readily available, so that way you can find out quickly, okay, does this need to be a multi-plug situation, so we can contain by plugging the holes and then cleaning up what's exists. With data exfiltration, that's usually not an option, because we also have to make sure that that hole is plugged and that nothing's coming out as well. So yeah, it becomes very complex very quickly, and you need to have all sorts of data. So not just from, your DLP, from where your most critical information resides, but also how did they get to that information? Because, when we go back to our castle analogy that we use all the time, if you don't find someone until they get to the crown jewels, you're like, well, how the hell did they get past all of that other security that we set up?
Yeah.
And so you're like, well, wow, okay, do we have like insider threat type of situation? Did someone let them in? So it's a whole bunch of questions, right, that are immediately going to jump through everyone's mind because they have such impactful consequences. And so those sorts of things, are what's going through a responder's head, and not being able to have, automated data coming to them to be able to, rapidly triage and reprioritize, then that's just time being wasted and potentially more data gone when you could have stopped it earlier. So yeah, it's definitely extremely important, especially from an incident scenario.
Yeah. And the other piece of this is it kind of ties back into your overarching DLP strategy. And that's kind of where we're thinking from a scale standpoint. Because when you get to a certain scale, you might have exfiltration that's not necessarily like external. It could just be an internal person that needs, like, hey, I just need to get this piece of data from here to there. So I just use this mechanism, right? Where they're technically not trying to do any harm. They were just trying to do their job, but in a way that kind of went around the organizational rules. So how did you get alerted to the data exfiltration is one of the pieces of the puzzle, right? Because if you're coming in as a new incident responder, right, and you're just trying to figure out, it's like, well, there's something that got leaked over here. Now if your alarms didn't catch that piece earlier, now that you're in the environment looking, that can be sending you down a trail of something that didn't need to be addressed right then, right? It should have been addressed back then by whatever mechanisms you had. But now you have to chase two at the same time to figure out, it's like, oh no, that was just, oh, Russ just wanted to go this way because he wanted to do his work. Okay, let's go back and look at this. Now that time has been wasted, the effort's been wasted. When what kind of scanning mechanisms, what kind of defense in depth approaches did you have? Because when you think of, okay, how is each, let's say, finding handled? How is the correlation done within your environment? That's where some of the AI pieces can come into play, right? To help with some of the correlations and mechanisms, and having something like a policy agent in order to help with the auto remediation actions. Great. But what we're trying to get to is, how do we overarchingly reduce that feeling that you get when you start to feel a little bit of the pressure building up, and you hear that music, especially as you count down in time, and you hear it slightly and it starts to get louder and louder until you get to the point that, hey, is your name Jeff? But Dragon, thank you for that. But going back to it, you want to think about your overarching strategy. Right? How do you assess your organization's unique data, apply data classification so that you can enable your automated workflows? And the best way to do this is start with the basics. As we mentioned within the beginning of the episode, it's like, hey, yeah, we identified a DLP potential tool, but we need a DLP strategy and architecture. Yes, it is. I would have never guessed that. But as we delve into it, it was a good guess. Yeah, could play the lottery. But when you start to think about it, I think part of the conversation goes to, do you understand the different components of your AWS environment? Do you understand how identity works and how all the different AWS services tie together? We spoke about 5 or 6 just within one scenario. That's where certificate knowledge comes in, or as we like to say, on a knowledge quest. And what is a knowledge quest? Well, I'll tell you what a knowledge quest is. It's that piece of our show where we deep dive into a couple pieces of articles you grab after your 5 a.m. run, right? You grab the beverage of your choice, coffee, tea, water, or other, and you sit down and say, hey, they were talking about DLP, and I want to learn what some of the steps are. How do I level up myself? How do I kind of build aura on a knowledge quest? How do I shift left, right? Because, it's the Chronicles. But most importantly, how do I go from an apprentice duelist to something else? Well, you have to know what an apprentice duelist does. And this terminology is very specific to that children's card game that we were speaking about. But I digress, because it gets the point across, right? Is you're trying to understand something. And how do you understand it? You start at data classification. That's how you get started. I'm just going to keep going, right? Yep. So this is a historical paper, but I want you to show you something, right? August 22, data classification. You go to the latest paper, data classification. I'm just going to keep saying it because it's an important part of the puzzle. And I went back on purpose because the one thing that stays consistent is understanding your data and how it is classified. When you start to think about it, it really becomes, hey, now that I understand my data, now I can start looking into service to see how I can protect my data. Like, what is Macy? What does it do? What are some of the features? What do I discover? Do I even put discovery on my sensitive buckets? That's often a conversation we have with customers, because if you know this bucket is sensitive, do you need to scan that bucket? Right? It's like that old thing in the woods, right? So the tree falls, right? But it's a question, because that's part of your strategy. So as you get back into understanding what Macy does and how it scans, then you can move on to config and some of the best practices for S3, things of that nature. And also, important warnings like this. In April 2026, AWS would disservice server-side encryption. It's a nice note. I saw that before.
Wonder why that happened.
Yeah. So just things to pop up. And this is why we go to the documentation live, right? Because when you are trying to develop not only yourself, but your security posture, you want to slowly walk through so that you seem like you're casting spells within your environment when you're speaking about, okay, we have these false positives in. How do I get rid of them? Well, let me tell you about custom data identifiers within Macy. What does it do? Well, you can put custom data identifiers to help identify your data that may be specific to your organization. Maybe your organization uses a code to scan in pallets of wood that looks like social security numbers for whatever reason, right? Those are the things that you want to build into your systems, right? Because when you get a hang of that, then you can say, okay, well, how do we just suppress this? How do we evaluate our resources? How do we continue on until we become legendary within our organization? Well, you skip ahead a bit, right? And you start to get towards the automation path. That's how you become legendary within your organization. And to continue on that path, you build in automation, you build in some AI into it, right? Because if you have the workflows carved out, then it becomes a lot easier to automate because now you can have this agent take care of this specific task if something were to happen. So it frees up your incident responders or people who are dealing with your sensitive data to do something else, right? I don't know, Russ, how important is that to you as an IR person?
Having the data available?
Yeah.
It's the most important. Yes, absolutely. It's critical to everything that an incident responder wants to do. You can't make decisions in the moment if you don't have the data. And yes, you can make information based on incomplete data. You're going to have to do that regardless, even if your data is fantastic. But as much information as you can get your hands on, the better high quality decisions you can make. And as much as possible, we also want to, in the moment of an incident, especially for incident response teams that aren't external and aren't dealing with multiple different customers, if it's just your own internal team, you might not see a lot of incidents. And so when you do see an incident that's maybe bad or time sensitive, like with data exfiltration, things like that, you want to be able to reserve your judgment for the important decisions. So things like, how do we find this data? You don't want to problem solve those ones. You want to give your responders as much ammo as possible. So that way, when it comes down to, okay, do we plug those holes in to prevent people from coming in, or do we plug the exfiltration holes to prevent our data from getting out? You have the information to make those judgment calls. And also you're not so bogged down by all the other decisions and problem solving you had to do just to get that data to make those decisions. So for me, it's everything. I can't do my job without it. And the less I have of it, the less quality of a job I'm going to do. So it's extremely relevant.
I feel like there's a riddle that should be made of this. I'll start to think about it. All right. It sounded like that kind of thing, right? That
riddle me, Batman. Riddle me this.
Yeah,
I didn't get those right.
So I think, you know why? Because take it one step at a time. Build up the experience points. Come back with a riddle. Come back with another side quest, and eventually you level up yourself and your overall security posture. But I think part of it also deals with a certain plan that Russ likes to talk about, speak about, mention.
And he did today have an incident response plan, so that way you don't have to make decisions. Stressful decisions, excuse me.
Yes. As stressful as picking out your favorite breakfast food for a year or having a random breakfast food throughout the year. But I digress. And yeah, we'll
it came full circle.
Yeah. More of a square because, we went left a couple of times.
Yeah, we had a couple of these. It's okay.
But till next week, when we have a guest, everybody have fun, take care, and a happy Monday.
You're just going to drop it like that.
Yeah.